we want to dig into the process, where we go through from thinking about it, planning, this journey to the full infrastructure journey, empowering end users. And I'd like to maybe start off with a question along the lines of, do we need to do it? Do we need to transition to cloud? And I guess embedded in that question is, well, why would people, where do you start? So start at the beginning of, where would we start? What's the rationale? How do people approach it? How do they weigh up the pros and cons? Maybe we could start, maybe I'll start with you if I can. Tom, you know, when your clients are considering this, how do they start and how do they approach it?
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So I guess the key place to start is kind of harking back a little bit to the conversation that Kaye was having this morning around cost. And how do you turn that into a value discussion? So if you're looking to deliver some kind of cloud infrastructure, what does it actually bring back to the business? How do we show that there's some real impact to the bottom line of the business so that it can continue to improve? And this is where, you know, solutions like the on-premise cloud come into play, because it's all about that automation, it's all about the self-service, it's all about making it easier, more consumable, removing the roadblocks that sit in place with a kind of classical on-premise infrastructure. So that's kind of where we think about it, and that enables us to then come back and say, well, okay, we've got a real business case that we can build off the back of deploying a cloud solution on-premise that will come and deliver some of that magic that you've been promised in the private cloud but maybe hasn't quite materialised because of the price increases, because of the network egress costs that you weren't expecting. So all of those things you can come back and say, actually, we can build you a solid return on investment for delivering some of these more capable infrastructures on premise.
So I hope this one's, I'm not sure it is. It is supposed to be on. I'll better take that one, thank you. Sure. Maybe not as well. So we'll just pass this one backwards and forwards so that we have a bit of consistency. Tom, are people starting from the perspective, when the clients approach you, are they starting from, I'm thinking about getting into cloud, or I'm thinking about getting away from public cloud, what's the most common? Or is it you guys approaching them saying, have you thought about moving to cloud? Or have you thought about moving from public to on-premises cloud? What's the typical scenario or mix of scenarios?
Yeah, there's definitely a mix of both. I mean, we see people coming from both ends of that spectrum. Some people are saying, I've got a lot of on-premise stuff. I kind of realise that it's not going anywhere. I need to keep it on-premise for data location because I've got other systems like mainframes that are not going anywhere and I need to be close to those for latency reasons. I've got regulators that say I have to keep that data close to me. Whatever it is, I know it's going to stay on-prem, but I need to operate in a more modern way, and I can't do that with my current infrastructure, so it's slowing me down. And on the other side, we do see people going, well, we moved to cloud, we kind of modernised some of our infrastructure, but we didn't do as much as we wanted. Actually, what we ended up doing was a lot more kind of just chucking VMs into a cloud provider, and oh my God, that was very expensive. How do we get back to something that supports the way that we're operating without requiring massive transformation to get us to a business model that actually works? So it's definitely from both sides of that.
From both sides. Adrian, does that ring true with, I'm doing my best with that one. Does that ring true, Adrian, with your experience as well?
So yes, I would say Tom already pointed that out very well. So it's actually about, especially in the small to medium-sized area of companies want to have a value stream on some point. So, and when we take a look at the traditional small to medium-sized companies, they are most likely in some kind of data center on-premise environment. And the problem with that is there is a reason why they began to become unhappy with that. So this is what we basically realize every time when we work with such a company. So it's about stagnation, it's about not providing value anymore, and this is especially for the business stakeholders a big problem. You know, you want to create a product, So, and especially when you talk with businesses or CEOs, for example, they don't care too much about where to host those stuff. They want to have their product basically at the client, you know. They say, why is mobile development so easy? You don't have an infrastructure, you know. Why must that be so complicated in web applications, for example? And this is the reason why cloud became popular and people want to get into the cloud. And of course there are fears like GDPR, who owns my data? Do I actually own my data anymore? You know, those are definitely fears, but still, cloud is the promise to get into progress again, to stay in motion. And this is the single most important thing in small to medium-sized businesses, because they don't have the large budgets. They need to create a constant stream. And this is where we, you know, come to the point where we say that cloud is a solution for that problem, but you need to, of course, take care of, can you take a public cloud provider? Do you need to go into some kind of, let's say, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, or some kind of that solution? So it's very specific and very contextual to every company out there. So this is the first thing we do. We talk about requirements, qualities, and context, and this determines where to go. But definitely, every form of migration into the cloud is a form of modernization as well. This is very important. So, and this is then when you talk about modernization, especially CEOs will become more interested into that, because this means, first of all, to get into progress again and do more with that. So cloud is a solution, but contextual.
You both raised this point about like fear about my data. Do you find that different in different parts of the world? I don't know how broad your experience is, and whether that's, say, just within Europe, whether in perhaps the German-speaking area that's more significant than in maybe the Anglo-influenced area. I mean, how do you, does it play out differently in different parts of Europe and the world?
I think from my experience, it tends to be largely regulation-driven. And I've worked with companies in South Africa, in Vietnam, and other places in Asia, where when the government is putting these regulations in about managing the data, the instant reaction of all of the local companies is to say, well, that means I have to own my data and it has to be in my building. And quite often that's not what the regulator says, but what they've decided, the way it gets interpreted is, it's much easier for me to comply if I know all of these things about the way that my data is stored. Yeah. So I don't think it's a Europe-centric problem. I think there's quite a lot of it here. I think it's probably more prevalent here, but I would say the rest of the world is catching up quickly.
Yeah, it's regulatory. I mean, just to echo that, I'm a director of a small museum back in the UK, and I know that when we were thinking about moving to cloud in our own small way, the other directors were very concerned. You know, will the data that we hold about, you know, particularly our GDPR implications, will it be safe somehow? And I thought that was quite interesting that it even at a very small museum that was in the minds of the directors as well, and that influences. But the other thing I'd like to draw out here is, I think I'm right in saying, really, Adrian, you were talking about being a base from which you could innovate. You know, whereas perhaps Tom, you were saying more cost saving. I mean, no, maybe I'm paraphrasing there, but clearly these are both drivers in business. One is I need to reduce my cost base. I need to keep the lights on, but it's got to cost more. You know, if I'm not careful. So I want to reduce the cost. But the other thing is, this is a platform that's taking me nowhere. I can't do anything with it. I mean, I'd be interested in the mix of those two drivers, Tom and Adrian. I'll come back to you guys in a minute when we get to that part of the conversation. But,
I mean, for me, I think those two are inextricably linked.
Okay.
I mean, the value, and this is why I'm careful to say it's the value and not the cost savings, okay, because you're not necessarily driving down costs, but trying to enable the business to move faster, generate more revenue, get more customers on board, release changes quicker, whatever that thing is. The more you can enable that, the more value you drive back into the business. So it's not necessarily about saving money, it's about how do I deliver more value into the business. And often that comes through, how do I enable innovation more, rather than how do I just reduce the bottom line. If I can do both, that's great, but that's not always possible.
And what about the question of who is it who has to be convinced within the business of this? Is this largely a technical discussion, or how sort of deeply into the management hierarchy will it go? Clearly the finance guys are going to be involved, but do you see the owners and CEOs and marketing and salespeople being involved in these decisions? I mean, who gets involved in that?
I mean, from my perspective, it's becoming more and more of interest. And that's coincided with the sort of industry trend that every business in almost every market now is an IT business. You know, there's nobody who's operating, well, there are very few people who are operating with just a PC in the corner. Most financial organisations, most educational institutions, they all require these massive amounts of IT to operate. So that means that there's more and more interest, and often, specifics around how IT is used or technology is used within the company will even form part of the reported board metrics of organisations, right up to that level. So that inherently means that the COO and the CEO are going to be interested in those solutions.
Yeah. Before we move on to Tasha and the deployment stage, anything Vladimir or Philip you want to add about this sort of planning or decision making? Shall I move to cloud? Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad that you brought me to it a little bit later, because most of our customers usually engage with Vesper once they've already made the decision to have their own infrastructure, manage their own cloud, and they usually reach that decision primarily based on cost. And it's because I think there's a tipping point when you reach a certain scale where the cost of managing that infrastructure, of having that amount of infrastructure to your business becomes so significant that it's no longer feasible to do that in public cloud. So often we work with people who are running HPC facilities in genomics or life sciences and things like that. But one of the things that you mentioned about GDPR and about where the data resides did resonate with me, because I remember talking to a genomics facility in the UK, and some of our other customers are they have their facilities based out in Iceland, because there's obviously huge benefits with power saving and cooling in some of those northern hemisphere countries. There are also challenges with volcanoes and things at the moment, but this was a UK government-backed genomics business, and they said that although they were able to host outside of the UK and could have looked into places like Iceland, that the amount of paperwork and the amount of sign-off and approval that they'd have to go through to host that outside of the UK was so significant that it was just something they were willing to entertain. And I guess that's probably the same in other countries as well. When you're looking at public organisations, that there's probably a mandate to host in their own countries.
Yeah, fear of the news cycle when, I don't know, UK national health data is hacked in Iceland or something.
Well, another one that's just occurred to me as well is that one of our customers used to have the contract for HMRC, which is the UK tax authority, and they hosted that out of a facility in Manchester. But they actually lost a contract to AWS, which struck me as quite ironic.
Bizarre.
AWS were notorious for moving finances into different countries and avoiding paying tax in the UK. So instead of back in the UK business, it was taken on board.
Vladimir, anything to add in terms of the decision process?
Usually all the decisions already made when it came to me, but some of the decisions usually about hardware and which software to run on it came through me. And most cases you have to check that software you're going to run it's met your security requirements and met your, of course, performance and other requirements. So planning is quite important part of whole process.
So Tasha, you deal with prospective clients and clients of Sardina. who are going through this decision-making process. So you must have some views on the decision-making process. And then I know you want to take the conversation on into deployment.
About next. Okay, so I agree with all of you that when we're speaking about planning, it's very necessary to take into account also thoughts of all departments of the company, and in the same time, it's very interesting, but some of decisions depends on market requests. And today we raised up a topic about GDPR, about necessity of location data near you, and really, yes, it's a current requirement of the European market, but also in the same time we are seeing growth of such requests in other markets, especially in Asian market, especially in USA market. Yes, it's also some kind of interest for the customers, and it's very necessary to take into account. And when we are speaking about planning stage, it's also very necessary to understand how a customer plan to grow, how plan to build his business in 5 years, in 10 years, and it's very necessary to predict this growth and to help this customer to build this smooth road to grow of his business. That's why such things like how you plan to build business, how you plan to scale your business is also very necessary to take into account on the planning stage. So I think we could move to
Carry on.
deployment phase. Deployment phase is something that brings headache to the customer, something that brings fear to technical side. But I think if we're speaking about deployment process, if there is something that we could describe as ideal deployment from the customer perspective, do we have some view on it?
Yeah, it takes 0 time, doesn't it?
And very smooth.
Yeah, it works perfectly. Do you need me to elaborate on that? No, I mean, I think, you know, looking at it from the kind of the top business stakeholder point of view, the actual deployment process itself is something they tend not to get that invested in. They tend not to focus in on it because it's a slightly less interesting piece. What they want to know is, how soon am I going to realise some of the benefits that you promised me when you brought me this business case 6 months, a year ago? So it's really about how can we make that process as smooth, as quick as possible to get something that's delivered and that does the job. So I think there's a lot of kind of working with the teams, sort of implementation teams at the customer to make sure that they really understand how they're going to test it, how they're going to integrate it, how they're going to deliver that product to the rest of the business. So that's kind of where I would say on that.
Super, super. And when we're speaking about hardware side, what we need to take into account when we are working on deployment phase?
That's the parcel.
There's a couple of things. There's on the one side, there's sort of what I saw more sort of global considerations. So people who have been working with public cloud are very much used to a software as a service type of model, so subscription model. So they're paying monthly for their service. And if you go to those businesses and ask them to spend several £100,000 on hardware, that can be a challenge in some cases. So it's working with customers to understand their requirements, their needs, you know, and that there are options available to be able to offer a similar service to those customers. The planning phase then moves into the designs of the systems. So you know, it's you have to look at, you know, what sort of cores you want, what sort of perhaps VMs, or you know, if what sort of performance you might want in storage, and you've got to size your nodes accordingly. And there's, you know, there's a huge, you know, variety of ways you can do that. You know, you could go to Dell, and you know, they could offer you something, possibly going to be quite expensive to do that, or you could go to a more open hardware base. You know, who do you go to? Who's going to configure it? Who's going to test it? Who's going to ship it to site? You know, if your co-location facility is not in the country where your main headquarters are, there can be challenges around physically getting hardware into that country through customs. There's all sorts of challenges there as well for people to consider. And then it's physically talking about standing the platform up as well. So you know, are you going to send somebody to site to go and do that installation work? Can it be done remotely? All these sorts of different considerations.
Yeah, I agree with you that we have lots of services which are connected with hardware, and we also need to take into account even such things like warranty. No one would like to deal with some issues, and it's also very necessary to take into account.
Yeah, and from a software standpoint, you usually also on deployment, you usually already know what you are going to build. You already planned all your networking stuff. You planned your capacity, but it's usually on our partners who decided amount of, for example, best set of disks, or for example, set storage if the case. Well, it's quite often. Or there are also some for deployment stages where and who would do that, because there are different models. You can, for example, have a pre-installed ready-made box, so you just deploy it to your data center, and all what you need to do just plug it in. So, or other possible option that all hardware already deployed to your site, installed, all wired up, but you still have a big headache about deployment of the software, and that's something you likely should think about.
I also would like to add that on software side, it's also very necessary to have this personal contact with customer, to provide him information about how deployment process is going, what kind of blockers they met, what kind of urgent, unexpected situations could be, and also to provide some clarification that how deployed system will work, and to provide some onboarding, some general information about deploy the system, because from the first view everything could be clear, but when we are moving to the final stage, yeah, some of questions could rise. And I think if we're speaking about some kind of migration and some kind of results of migration, what we could to add like to ideal scenario?
So when it comes to migration, we need to think it's not about hardware only, it's not about the cloud. So migration is a form of modernization, which means you put something from somewhere to another place. So this is what you do in a migration, for example, a string of data or something like that. So and this is very common, because in the last 20 years, small to medium-sized businesses built a lot of stuff. And they need to, you know, in order to get that running again, from a stagnation standpoint, they need to migrate, so it can be the cloud. But that's not basically just, we heard that in the cloud-based presentation, lift and shift. Lift and shift is not always, you know, the best solution for a modernization, because it's actually just a horizontal shift. It's not really modernizing anything regarding the software itself, the value process and stuff like this. So we need to think of a cultural change in the company. So the company as a whole. And this starts, for example, with the delivery process. So when we talk about deployment, for example, we talk about delivery, you know? So for example, continuous delivery. Most companies out there still today aren't able to continuously deliver software. For example, most people don't deploy on Fridays. They don't do that. And they should do. They should be able to do that, and they should practice it. But this idea alone displays quite a lot, or it includes quite a lot of all thoughts we have today. And in order to get a good deployment running, a migration running, you need to implement those things before you actually start. So it's very important to take everyone into account into a company, so basically include everyone in a migration pattern. You know, starting from the CEO with the idea, the CTO with the technical implementation, and then all the steps in the vertical. And this is very important to understand. So we need to understand that we want to get into some form of continuous delivery, and then we can start to think about the actual migration. Because after the migration, we need to stay in that flow that we continuously deploy software and continuously create value, the value stream. This is what I would say.
There's a question from the audience, Tasha. I don't know if you can read that.
Okay. So,
Thank you for your question.
We have a question. Are there any standards that we are missing that could make interoperability drastically better?
Any missing standards?
Missing standards. Well, there are a lot, I think, because while we have a lot of standardization on OCI drivers, for example, in Kubernetes, you also have a lot of variables in, for example, Linux itself. But I'm not sure that it's a good idea to say that let's standardize it, because otherwise it will just looks like a Red Hat and nothing else. But while we have some sort of standards, we have like some standardized runtime. Better if we also think about ways of expose some networking parts, maybe some of flow configuration, maybe, not sure. And the big thing is interconnection between your token parts of your software. It's okay if you just live within one single Kubernetes, okay, or you live within a single OpenStack, okay. You also have just one private network, that's great. But what if you have a heterogeneous part? Some of your data lives in one data center, other in other, and maybe you want to have edge nodes. That's a big thing to standardization.
Shall I read this next question from the audience? Another question from the audience. Thank you very much. It builds on a theme we heard earlier about day two costs, or the ongoing costs, I suppose. So, and a great intro to this question: how do customers make sure they're not building the next legacy system? We just heard, I think from Alessandra, that the second, no, it wasn't. It was from our Sardina colleague. The second most used OpenStack version is from 2018. Right, suggests that people don't want to move because of the cost and disruption of moving. How do customers keep track of these technical developments? And coming back to the opening here, how do you be sure you're not building? So you've got these great aspirations, Adrian and Tom. You want to build a platform that enables innovation. Oh God, it hasn't worked again. I'm stuck with another legacy system. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, I think this is a particularly tricky point, and it's something that many organisations are really struggling with. And from an infrastructure management point of view, I think we probably need to take a leaf out of the developers' books and look at the continuous deployment pipelines, as you were talking about a minute ago. This is something that I'm increasingly seeing used now, where the teams that manage the infrastructure are operating in the same way, where they have automated tools to deploy their infrastructure environments, as well as to deploy the software on top of those environments. And having, lowering the barrier of entry to get those additional versions deployed, and understanding what your testing steps are, making sure that deployments are automated and de-risked as far as they can be, really makes it easier to continue to deploy those things. And it's partly that technical piece But alongside that, you need the organisational support to move away from this project mentality of, I need to deploy some new infrastructure, I needed to do this, great, I've got a project, I go and deploy it, project's closed, and I will never look at that piece again until the security come around and tell me that there's a risk because there's a security patch in it and I haven't addressed it. To, okay, I am delivering a service to the rest of my business, how do I ensure that that service continues to be as good as it can be, and what do I need to do to maintain the components of that service?
You have a view?
And what I like to add is about architecture of your solution, you know. And the point is that when we're thinking of a migration, because we are in a legacy state, we don't want to get again into a legacy state, so we need to make sure this is actually, you know, on a sustainable basis, you know. And we need to implement or think about qualities or non-functional requirements in that case. And this is, for example, substitutability. Not too many people are actually talking about that when we're talking about cloud. But cloud is very closely connected to something like containers. And this is the reason why containers are so interesting, or actually so widely used. And this is because they are connected to the idea of microservices. So microservices, when used correctly, for example, they have this quality of substitutability built in. And we talked about continuous delivery, so you should be in a flow. And what you should be able to do is, after 1 year, after 2 years, substitute parts of your application which becomes old, you know, which tends to be a legacy part of your system. Because in the older idea of monolithic systems, we always had some pain points, but they were so large and we couldn't basically substitute those. And those were the reasons why we actually needed to migrate this. And when we implement this idea of substitutability into our system with a continuous flow of, you know, value and delivery, we are actually able to replace the parts which will create pain in the future. And this is the perfect recipe for avoiding the legacy trap. This is what I write and speak often about. So the cloud helps us. You know, the cloud is a target for this because cloud is made for this specific type of aspect. When we talk about agnosticism, for example, containers are all about agnosticism. So we can basically run them everywhere. For example, if we go for a strategy, a very small company can start in every cloud, basically, even on a data center with some form of containers. Docker, Swarm, Kubernetes, doesn't matter. You can start with that. Then you can scale to, for example, a Kubernetes cluster. Then you can, you know, scale to edge clusters. You can basically do everything. And as long as you can do those things, you will never, when you do it right, of course, you will never run into a legacy trap again. And this is basically how we actually approach this after, you know, having that for so many years to struggle with legacy systems. And every time when we tried to move a legacy system into the same pattern again, it failed again after already 1 year. That's actually the truth. Yeah.
Go on, Philip.
Just to say, I'm a hardware guy, so my answer is quite narrow and all about hardware. But I think when you're taking a software-defined approach, you avoid some of those pitfalls with the hardware. So if you compare something like Ceph, whereby you know, you buy the amount of storage that you need for day one, and then you add additional nodes in as you want to scale, with a traditional appliance where, okay, I have to look at what I might need in 3-5 years, so I'm going to buy a petabyte of storage today, even though I only need 200 terabytes. You know, when that becomes full, that capacity is full, I have to then move it to a bigger storage appliance, as opposed to Ceph, where you just continually add additional nodes. You know, perhaps there's been some innovations in the hardware, with new CPU architecture from ARM or from AMD. On the compute nodes, we're just adding additional nodes, and when the original nodes come to the end of their life cycle, then they can be retired without having to build a whole new cloud and a new platform. We're still managing that with the same original software which we started with on day one. So we have less of those migrations, those sort of big lift and shift migrations, and it's just an ongoing evolution of the platform.
A seamless integration, right? And a seamless progression.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I don't know, the platform guy more said about that not to have that troubles with the drivers, you just need to update. If the vendor have interest from his audience, it should certainly would do some attention on his drivers he made. Or, I'm not sure, sometimes you eventually thinking that our driver just gets into the platform and as a part of open source platform, and so you don't have the trouble anymore. But if you install platform once and then do not update it for years, you certainly will end up with the trouble. Of course, it's not helping with your end product, but keeping the platform updated is also quite important part.
I would add to that it's very important, because what companies want to achieve is to reduce total cost of ownership. And when you buy a system one, then we are under day one cost, and we're going to the day two cost, and actually to be able to maintain it. So what does this mean as a company? If you are basically the owner of the infrastructure, means that you need to be able to handle it, which is not a big problem in a medium-sized company, let's say 500 people upwards. It's no problem, you will have those people there, but everything below is questionable. There are, especially in the smaller area where you're talking about 50 people or 100 or 200 people even, we oftentimes do not have cloud ops or SRE people. You know, this is a problem. So even if you buy something, you won't be able to maintain it, and you, as just said, you will run into problems. And this is a form of legacy problem as well. You run into a stagnation again, security risk, and all that kind of stuff. And so it's very important to keep in mind that you need to, this is contextual. So a small business, a medium-sized, and an enterprise business does have other requirements for this. You know, and it's, for example, a small company can just run with a ready-to-use platform as a service thing, which you can just rent on most cloud providers out there. When you go into the mid-size, you can't do that anymore. You need to do something for yourself, and then you need to take into consideration that you need to have basically an entirely different setup. And this is what I just wanted to add. So keeping the entire life cycle of the entire solution in mind is very important in this case. And cloud and infrastructure is one part of that, and it needs to be connected.
And I would like to ask maybe the last question. When we are speaking about cloud journey, it's not something that we could describe in one day or in 1 month. It's something that like ongoing process. And I would like to ask you, do we hear our customers? How can we implement their feedback in the future? Because they start their journey with one aim, with one goal, but during the few years, it could be changed. So do we hear our customers?
I think that's almost the most difficult question that we come across. I mean, of course, everybody, their needs are changing all the time, and you're doing the right things. I mean, you've got to engage with the customers. You've got to understand what journeys they're on and how they're trying to get there. And from my perspective, that includes understanding what their business aims are, so that you can kind of run ahead of what they're saying they want from a technical perspective a little bit, and try and be prepared to kind of think about what we can deliver that's going to be providing the business capabilities rather than just the technical capabilities.
Well, from the software standpoint, usually whenever user wants, if it's already existing open stack, okay, that's all not a problem at all, but it's also usually not that big deal to write some additional plugin to OpenStack. For example, if you want to have something, there are plenty of services that can do heavy lifting of your service. Well, that's more about OpenStack, but if we are talking about Kubernetes, we have things like Helm. In OpenStack, you have something like Heat or something else, and you can use it to bring in and cover different needs.
Yes, so when we think of how we get on after or during even the migration, I think let's say, a key feature of an ongoing migration is that we talked about the stagnation, and then suddenly you start with a migration into a new type of architecture, you're suddenly in progress again. So you always start with the pain points, of course. You don't start with the unnecessary stuff to migrate. You start with the pain points, with the low-hanging fruits, you know. And this is already formed. So imagine we have an old Windows Server cluster, something like that, running old PHP, C# stuff there, and we want to migrate that into a modern version, like something in microservices in the cloud. And as soon as we do that, we have some kind of federator in between those both worlds, which is the new application, and it takes the upstreams of both of those environments. And then we are basically in a state where we have time again, because we already are able to fight and mitigate, tackle those problems, which really does pain to the company, and or it inflict pain to the company. And with that approach, we are actually able to do that innovation basically on day one, starting on day one after the start of the migration. And this is another nice side effect is you don't get into the hurry to actually get rid of your old system. So you can take your time, because you can, for example, even if you have security reasons with the old system, you can even run that in isolation and federate this. And take your step, because not every legacy system, especially in larger enterprises, take some German companies, they still run on mainframe. You know, you can't just, you know, say, oh, 12 months and you are done. No, a migration can be 6 to 7 years long, you know, even longer. So there are longer migrations out there. And you need to have create an environment where you have this, again, continuous delivery idea, where you continuously do new things and create this new form of application you want to do that. And eventually, on some point, the legacy system disappears, and you never, ideally, you never run into the legacy trap again. Yeah.
A few words.
Yeah, I think that on the hardware side, we spoke earlier that typically these cloud platforms grow over time. Nobody's storage ever shrinks, so it's always worth working with customers to understand how and when they're going to scale the platform. One of the challenges that we often have is lead times. People who want to deploy new services, they need the hardware to do that. So if we're working and communicating well with our customer, we can hold inventory ready for them to deploy that. Especially if what we try and do is, you know, get them to standardise on a particular platform. We'll often have a number of customers who are using the same platform, so we can hold some buffer stock. So if somebody they need a new service and it needs a load of new nodes, we're able to deliver that very quickly. I think the other thing that we always need to be aware of is, you know, hardware changes. So you know, the CPU vendors are constantly evolving. You know, it's yeah, we've seen a massive core race over the last years, and we're now seeing sort of new entrants into the market where traditionally Intel was very dominant. AMD is going to take a huge market share, and we're seeing now ARM is becoming very competitive as well. With the new Ampere systems, and also NVIDIA using the ARM-based architecture for a Grace CPU. So what we need to do is ensure that these systems are perhaps certified for the OS that they want to use, or, you know, the platform that they want to use. So it's very much a sort of ongoing relationship with the customer to be talking about what they're looking at next, you know, what their future plans are, just to ensure that when they do come to upgrade or expand, that it's as seamless as possible.
You end on a very good point about the continued communication between all parties. We didn't really have time to get onto that. But Tasha, I wonder, did you want to try and answer your own question as a final remark as well? Because you have a lot of experience.
Yes. Definitely, it's very necessary to be involved in communication with the customer, not only on deployment phase. And customer is the best source of ideas, it's the best source of decision which will help to solve this problem. So I think that the main thing is to build this dialogue between customer, between software vendor, hardware vendor, and all of parts involved in this process. And in this case, in this dialogue, we could find some answers.
Well, thank you very much to all the panel, to all of your questions, to you, Tasha, co-moderator. With that, I'll ask you to give the panel a round of applause and we'll move on to our next speaker.